If someone a couple of years ago had told me I'd be introducing Jessica Mitford to an audience of my colleagues, I'd have doubted I'd be so lucky ever. But here we are, and I'm glad one of the perks of my service for the Continental Association gives me the honor of making that introduction. I'm sure Jessica has heard close to 449,000, more or less, introductions, from oh so witty to oh what a pity. So I'm going to spare her and you any extravagant exposition. What I'd like to do very briefly, however, is to recommend one of Jessica's books, printed in 1956. The title is Daughters and Rebels, and you may well ask, how am I going to find this book, printed that long ago, that's been out of print for many years? The answer: become a volunteer for your local Friends of the Library organization. It was while gathering books for resale to benefit our library, and as a volunteer for that organization, that I found the thoroughly delightful Daughters and Rebels. I should add that any book by Jessica Mitford is a delight to read, including her latest, The American Way of Birth. Look for it in your bookstore in the fall. It's due for publication in November. Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to present our great benefactor and gifted author, Jessica Mitford.
Thank you. To be here, and it's a tremendous honor to me to have come. I've been fascinated to meet so many of you, and also to have attended many of the really interesting sessions. I got a terrific education out of those, because I might as well tell you right now that I'm really here under rather false pretenses. I've never been an active member. So, mine is going to be kind of a worm's eye view of the whole thing. I'm really just a scribbler, writing. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit of the inside story of my involvement in the book and how it came about, and what has happened since, and some of the troubles of publication and some of the consequences. In the first place, my husband, Bob Truehaft, got me into this. He's a lawyer and in California representing numerous trade unions. And along about the middle 1950s, he began to notice, to his great displeasure, that the hard-fought-for union death benefit, whether it was $1,000, $1,200, whatever, intended for the use of the widow and children, would mysteriously disappear into the pockets of an undertaker, because that was what would be charged for the funeral. They knew exactly the amount that everybody got. So Bob started organizing the Bay Area Funeral Society, which began as a sort of research committee devoting itself to finding out about the original one, which was the Seattle Memorial Committee. So anyhow, I thought, I'm sorry to say, that I used to mock these good people. I'd say, well, I mean, what are you doing? You know perfectly well that we're robbed every day in the supermarket and by the landlord, so why turn on the poor undertakers? I mean, they have a right just as much as anyone. Until he began to bring home the funeral trade magazines with these wonderful titles: Casket and Sunnyside, and Mortuary Management, and what I think is one of the best titles ever, Concept, the Journal of Creative Ideas for Cemeteries. I mean, the very titles are so seductive. So needless to say, I started reading them like mad, and I found therein an entire wonder world of the mortuary that I'd never known existed. I hadn't realized, for instance, that you could have a choice of foam rubber or inner spring mattress in your eternal sealer casket, any of that, you know, and the wonderful colours they come in. And I began to send away for free samples. For example, I mean, there's the very name is so seductive, the Practical Burial Footwear Company of Columbus, Ohio. And I was wanting to see what practical burial footwear would look like. So I sent for some, and it turned out that I got the Fit-a-Foot Oxford. That's Fit-A-F-U-T, Fit-a-Foot. And it's Fit-a-Foot because it does up like ordinary Oxfords in the front, but the back is sort of relaxed, you know. And also, it's sort of shaped odd, you see, in order to fit the deceased foot after rigor mortis sets in. And there's a leaflet that comes with it that explains that these were developed after 2 years of research. And I thought this was a wonderful example of the uses of research. I mean, the whole thing was too riveting. Unfortunately, my son, who was about 15 at the time, wore them all around the house. And they fell apart. So otherwise, I'd have brought them to show you. Then I also sent for the natural expression former. Now, this is it's an undertaker's aid. What it is visualize a this sort of moon shape, half moon, of plastic that goes inside here, you see, in your lips. So then, when rigmo sets in, as we call it in the trade, it can be made into a most lovely smile. But actually, I've left in my will the expression I want, which is going to be slightly different. I hope I can find something. Anyway, I got most interested in all this, and this is what got me interested in doing a book, you know. So the first thing I did, however, Bob was always soliciting people to write articles about the emerging funeral society. So I did one called St. Peter, Don't You Call Me, from that old song, you know, I can't go because I owe my soul to the company store, sort of showing how expensive it all was. And really that article, although it's quite short, was like a sort of outline for what eventually became the American Way of Death. Anyhow, the funeral society, the Bay Area Funeral Society, ordered reprints of this for their sort of educational purposes. And somehow one of them fell into the hands of Caspar Weinberger, and we've seen him just lately. But in those days, he was sort of liberal Republican who had a weekly program called Profile Bay Area, which was a television program on public broadcasting. And he would, you know, deal with various things, transportation, things of interest in the San Francisco area. And so he put on a debate, and the debaters were, on one side, the Reverend Josiah Bartlett, a Unitarian minister, and myself, and on the other side, two undertakers whose names were actually Mr. Sly and Mr. Grimm. Just happened to be, you know. So anyway, it was quite a sort of interesting and amusing moment. And so the television columnist of the San Francisco Chronicle wrote this up, and he said that this particular little program, this half-hour thing, had produced more mail to his column than any time since The Bad Seed had been shown in a local junior high school. So just in the middle of all this is to show you how things develop in a funny way. A writer from the Saturday Evening Post called Rule Tunley came through California and through San Francisco, and somebody brought his attention to all this. So he decided he'd try to write an article for the Saturday Evening Post. He was one of the senior people, writers for them. So he called me up, and he came round and had tea, and I gave him copies of Mortuary Management and showed him the practical burial footwear and all that. And And so he did write an article, and I introduced him to all the people in the funeral society, because I told him, I'm nothing in the society, it's really these other people are doing all the work. But anyhow, he wrote it up and sort of featured, the way they do journalists, they sort of feature one person. And so he featured Jessica Truhaft, Oakland housewife, sort of gallant little me fighting the beer barons, as he put it, that kind of thing. So he wrote this up, and the article came out in the Saturday Evening Post called "Can You Afford to Die?" And it was really more or less all about the Bay Area Funeral Society. Well, then everything began to happen. The editor of the Post said that they'd got more mail about this article than on any other since he'd been editor. And the letters began coming to me. But of course, nobody knew my address, so they were just at, Jessica Truhaft, Oakland. So one of them, in fact, is Jessica Truhaft, Cheap Funerals, Oakland. And by the way, I thought that would be such a good name for the organisation, but it probably wouldn't suit everyone. Anyhow, so we got this extraordinary outpouring of letters, and the Funeral Society did too, the Bay Area Funeral Society. And so Tunley wrote and said, why don't you write a book about this, since there's so much interest. And I think I wrote to him, that's right, and said, why don't you write a book about this? And come out here again, and I'll give you all the material we have. And he said, no, he didn't want to, and why don't you? So that's how it all began, actually. Well, then there were a few problems about the publishing of it. The first problem, in fact, there was only one real problem, which was that while the publishers of my first book, Daughters and Rebels, which was Victor Gollancz in England and Houghton Mifflin in America, both gave me a contract, not very exciting, but not much money or anything, but enough to make it clear they wanted the book on the basis of the first chapter. And then I wrote another 100 pages or so, which included filming. Well, that did it. They both wrote back, both publishers, and said, this is too revolting, it's got to go. You'll either have to leave out that chapter or we won't publish the book, So I wasn't having any of that. And it seemed to me that since 99% of Americans in those days certainly were embalmed, that the least one could do is to explain the whole disgusting procedure so that they would know exactly what was in store for them down the line something. So Bob and I just talked about this, and we thought, well, we'll just sort of mimeograph it and sell it to anyone who wants it and not bother about a publisher. But in the end, my brilliant agent got Simon & Schuster interested. They took it, and they loved the embalming chapter. It was their favourite part. So then the book came out, and this brings me to my first visit to Denver, which was in this connection, because there was a book and author lunch sponsored by the Denver Post. It was an annual event. I don't know if they still do it, but they might. I don't know. They do? Yeah. And so it was held at the Brown Palace Hotel. And so I was staying there at the Brown Palace Hotel as part of a sort of book tour. In fact, Alan Dulles was also on there. He was a CIA fellow, and he'd written this book about the CIA. And he did make one rather good remark, which I thought was friendly of him. He said that Khrushchev, when he'd said, we will bury you, would never have said that if he'd read my book and found out how expensive it was. So anyhow, I'm sort of sitting around in the Brown Palace Hotel waiting for it to be time for this grand occasion, the lunch, when the UPI called up. The UPI man phoned, and he said, I wanted to ask you about this thing in today's Congressional Record, a statement about you and your book by Congressman Utt of Santa Ana, California, which is, cemetery land, actually. And so I said to him, well, I'd like to see the statement. What did he say? So he brought it around. It was pages long. And it was mostly, well, it was blasting me and my book, and saying that the book was a communistic and atheistic attack on, and so on. And it also included my entire FBI record, which is quite long. And, all the things from the House Un-American Activities Committee pages. So the poor young man who was accompanying me on this book tour said, "You'll have to deny all of that. I mean, just tell them it's not true, you see." And so I said, "Well, Dan, I can't very well do that because it's all true, actually." Anyhow, so the upshot of this, by the way, just a parenthetical thing about Congressman Ott. He also said in a statement, "For myself, I would rather be buried by one of our fine, upstanding American funeral directors than to set foot on the soil of godless Russia." And I thought that was such a sort of marvelous non sequitur. But anyhow, a few years later, he had his wish, and then the New York Times, in its obituary of Congressman Ott, said, Congressman Ott, best known in his 6 terms in Congress for attacking Jessica Mitford's book. I thought that was rather good for 6 terms. So anyway, the results weren't so bad because the New York Times then published a full editorial, How Not to Read a Book, in which they absolutely blasted the whole business, you see. And so that was followed by other newspapers around the country. I think, so at least half a dozen had editorials saying how absurd this thing was. And so, of course, it was all great publicity in a way for the book. That was good. Well, I wanted to go on to some of the results of what had happened next. And over the years now, after all, it's almost 30 years since The American Way of Death came out, I suppose the thing that was most amazing to me was the growth in the cremation statistics. I think the time that I was writing that book, the statistics nationwide for cremation were something like 3.5%. Now it's very regional. In other words, there were always more on the West Coast and so on than the rest of the country. But now it's gone up to, I believe, 30%. And in places like Marin County, which is one of the wealthiest enclaves in California, it's gone up to about 60% of all Marin people. Now this is terrifying for the undertakers because, I mean, that's where the rich live, And it's not a matter of saving money or anything, they just don't want all that. So, this is the thing that I think is perhaps the most significant advance that's happened, except, of course, also by the growth of the funeral societies, which has spurred the whole thing on from another direction too. But there was a very sad letter, editorial or article in Mortuary Management just the other day, saying that it was about the falling death rate. It's really, here's the point. What they said is that because of the 55-mile speed limit, and because of medical advances in heart disease and cancer and so on, the death rate keeps falling. Well, I can see it's tiresome for them, One can't help sort of sympathizing. Well, this whole thing of the attack and the attack on the funeral societies and on things like The American Way of Death, my book, as being communistic and subversive, you'd think it would sort of be over by now, but just a few years ago, I was on a speaking tour of the South, mostly to colleges and so on, but one of the places where I was speaking was the Ohoopee Public Library in Vidalia, Georgia. Now, Vidalia is a very small place. It's about 40,000 pop, that kind of thing. And it's so small that even people in Savannah hardly know of its existence. But the Ohoopee Public Library sent out press releases and so forth. And what they were doing, death is very big these days on campuses and libraries and that. And they have sort of various viewpoints and so forth. So the OHUP Public Library was having weekly meetings on death, which would be, they were on subsequent, every Tuesday, let's say. There'd be a philosopher speaking on the philosophic angle and that, and a religious person, and then they had me on the death industries, you see. And the American Legion attacked. It was quite fascinating because they repeated all the same stuff that UTT had, and they put out enormous sort of counter press releases saying, what is this, what is the OHUP Public Library doing supporting this subversive person's views? So the librarians fought back. The librarians, by the way, are to me, the salt of the earth. They're always the sort of real bulwark for the First Amendment on almost any issue that comes along. So the librarians fought back with the First Amendment thing about everybody has his or her right to speak up their mind in the OHUP Public Library, And so they did more than that, though. They rather brilliantly got the idea of sending invitations to the funeral industry, to everybody from miles around connected with funerals, funeral directors and cemetery people, the whole lot, So on the night of the meeting, well, by the way, with all that publicity, the meeting had to be changed from a small room somewhere into the high school auditorium, and it was absolutely packed. And so the chairman of the meeting led off by saying that we have invited, that everybody can have his or her say in the OHUP Public Library, and then said that we've invited special guests, free of charge, any members of the funeral profession who would like to be recognized. So upon this, 12 black suits stood up all in a row, and these black suits, and then they sat down. So I sort of gave my talk, and it was well received because, people in Vidalia, as elsewhere, have been very much victimized by undertakers. So following the lead of the chairman, when the question time came, I said, I think I'd like to start off by asking any members of the funeral profession if they would have any questions or discussion. So finally a black suit rose, and he said, I am a vault man. I sell vaults. I'm really, my southern accent isn't that good, but he was saying, I am a vault man, I sell vaults. And he said, I listened to Miss Mitford's speech, and she never said that when Jesus Christ our Lord was crucified, a rich man gave him his vault. And then he sat down. So I said, well, since I spend a lot of time in motels and the only reading they give you is the Bible, I'm very well aware, of course, of the story of Joseph of Arimathea. But if you read on down just a little bit, in the Bible, you'll see that Jesus didn't stay there all that long. He was up and down. So anyway, that's just a few sort of little things that occur. But I suppose that the most dramatic thing that has happened in the last, ever since the funeral societies began organising, has been the Federal Trade Commission taking a stand. And when that first started, which was, they first announced the rule, the FTC did, in 1975, and the industry swung into action with its characteristic belligerence, responding as to a call to arms. The headlines in the American Funeral Director, "It will be a costly war," great banner headlines. And the National Funeral Directors Association then raised an initial war chest of $500,000, later augmented to $1 million. They denounced the rule as communistic, atheistic, revolutionary, and the past president of the of the New York State Funeral Directors said, tampering with the soul of America. and so on. I mean, so it was just an amazing thing. And the rule itself was actually promulgated in 1984. I had the great pleasure, actually, of being one of the public members to testify. Now, here's how the FTC works. In other words, when they propose a rule like this one, they are obliged by law to hold hearings in various cities around the country, about half a dozen, let's say, Washington, D.C., Atlanta for the South, Los Angeles for the West, and that kind of thing. So I was detailed to be a spokesman. They have several spokesmen from consumers and then several spokesmen from industry. So it's like a sort of debate. And then each side is subject to cross-examination by the others. So what happened in my case was that I went down to Los Angeles to testify, and I sort of, said the usual things about the rule and the fact that it was only trying to bring the funeral directing business into conformity with ordinary fair business practice, this sort of thing, you see. And to my great pleasure, the person who cross-examined me was Howard C. Rather. Now, Rather was, for 30 years or more, the executive director of the National Funeral Directors Association. And when writing The American Way of Death, well, it couldn't have been written without his contributions, because he's really about the dumbest man you ever heard of. And I mean, the thing, for instance, right at the very front of the book, the epigraph of the book is, "Funerals are more and more becoming part of the American way of life. Howard C. Rather." I mean, you come off with these sort of things. And I once had the great pleasure, in fact, of being on the Phil Donahue show with him. Phil Donahue, this was ages ago, and Phil Donahue was in Philadelphia. And so he called, this would have been, I don't know, maybe 64 or 5. And so he got Howard C. Rather and me, and for an audience, he had college students, and they were in fits, absolutely convulsed with laughter, all the way through the program, because that's the way Howard C. Rather is, he's just marvelous. And so anyhow, in this, the rule as first proposed by the FTC would require that the undertaker was obliged to not try to influence the family in the choice of a casket. And so he harped on this one. So Howard C. Rather questioned to me, now, John Doe dies of jaundice, and his widow has selected a yellow casket. Is it not then incumbent on the funeral director to point this out and to suggest that she choose a different colour? So I said, well, I don't know. To me, I think, I said I'd never thought of this before, but I'd like to have a matching one, and that if I died, if it was jaundice, yellow, or if I died of scarlet fever, red. So he didn't stop at that. So he said, Mrs. Smith is a very heavy-set woman, and her husband has chosen a casket which is much too small. Would it not be wise then for the funeral director to point this out to him and say that he should choose another one? Well, who knows? I mean, perhaps he was always saying to her, "You're much too fat, you ought to go on a diet." And he's sort of trying to get even, So it's very hard to sort of predict these things. But so anyhow, the rule did pass, such as it is, and it was much better than anybody had expected, actually. I mean, it really did go pretty, I mean, it was sort of fair and not extreme, and so on. But the question now is, how is that rule enforced? I mean, what happens if somebody makes a complaint to the local Federal Trade Commission office against an undertaker? Well, what I found out is that too often the complainant gets a real royal bureaucratic runaround. Not long ago, I had a letter from Mr. Harris, aged 76, who was thinking about his funeral. And so, wishing to spare his daughter the job of arranging it, he telephoned a funeral home and asked for their price for a simple cremation. And the funeral director who answered said about $300. So Mr. Harris's next step was to ask the funeral home for a written price list. Oh, thanks, that's lovely. Let's have this bit of water. So they sent this eventually arrived, and the itemized prices on the printed list came to $525, so 225 more. So Mr. Harris knew all about the FTC funeral rule. He'd made quite a study of it, and he was aware of its provisions. So he wrote a complaint to the nearest FTC regional office, which is the San Francisco one. I mean, they have regional offices in, half a dozen towns, I guess. Mr. Harris sent me a copy of his letter, together with a reply from an FTC staff member, and the staff member wrote as follows. He said, "We have only limited resources to take formal action against possible violators. Our actions are taken only on behalf of the general public and are designed to correct those violations which affect a significant number of consumers." Well, that seemed to me to be totally ridiculous, because isn't Mr. Harris a member of the general public? And was not the funeral home's misrepresentation exactly what the FTC rule was supposed to stop and prevent? So then I had a conversation with a lawyer in the same regional office, with whom I discussed this correspondence, and he was not at all helpful. He said, "We don't represent individuals. This is an isolated case." So I asked, well, what is considered to be a significant number of consumers? And he said, well, there is no set number. So I said, well, would it be 3 or 6 or 100? And his answer was, I couldn't say. So I was really frustrated, and I called up the FTC in Washington, and I talked to Commissioner Patricia Bailey, who was on the commission at the time. And she immediately saw the point, and after that things happened quite quickly. The director of the regional office, informed of the facts of the matter by Commissioner Bailey, promptly investigated and determined that Mr. Harris's case was completely mishandled, his words. He assured me that the staff member who wrote the letter and the lawyer with whom I spoke have been appropriately admonished. Well, that's all right, but I mean, this incident does raise some questions. How many potential funeral buyers have the gumption of Mr. Harris, the tenacity to make a complaint to the government agency, and to a writer whom he had never met? And should one have to go to the expense of a telephone call to Washington to resolve this difficulty? So this, I think, to me anyhow, does point out the need for total, eternal vigilance on the part of the Memorial Society about this kind of thing. And I'm sure that, that plus the need for legislation, and I have a copy of that interesting model bill that was discussed the other morning in one of the sessions here, and which I'm going to bring home, because one of our assemblywomen, a very bright person called Jackie Spear, is proposing exactly that. She's going to introduce legislation for California, which presumably will go much further than the FTC. And I think that things like this model bill, and the more that this organization can help to facilitate and to educate legislators particularly. It seems to me, in fact, that it wouldn't be a bad idea to assemble lists of legislators in every state, because this is always a state matter, not a federal, and sort of create a network of communications so that people can be aware of what's happening. For instance, I don't know of any pending legislation anywhere else except California, but others may. So that this is the kind of thing I think that this kind of exchange of information would be really helpful. Now, I've talked far too long, I'm afraid, but what I really long for is some questions and discussion from all of you. I think I'd like to sit for a while they're having the question.
Near the phone?
Yeah, near this thing, maybe. That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Have her sit over here.
Oops. I'll sit, yeah. Okay, that's much better. Yeah. That's lovely. Thank you. Perfect.
Get my cake.
Okay, now, how about some questions? Yes.
Mrs. Mitford, would you mind sharing with the audience the story you shared with me last night about Melvin and Bella?
Oh, that, yeah. The question, I better repeat the question, because otherwise I don't think you can all hear. The question was an experience with Melvin Belli when preparing the book. And here's what it was. I was, while writing The American Way of Death, I was rather fascinated to find out what happens in the case of these huge sort of airplane disasters where hundreds are killed, you know, in a single accident. And one knows that the undertakers go racing to the scene, hoping to pick up some business. But, of course, lawyers also, you know, personal injury lawyers. So I called up Melvin Belli, the famous king of torts, as he's known, and to make an appointment to discuss this with him. And he said, yes, he'd gladly do it. So I went there to his office, and he kept me waiting for, I think, about 3 hours. I was simply steaming. I sat there watching while the office was absolutely filled with the lame, the halt, and the blind. Everybody had either a cast or a neck thing here, you know, that kind of thing. And so those were his clients. And finally, by the time I got to see him, I was really angry, you know, being kept waiting all that time, and he could see that I was steamed up. So, and then it turned out he really hadn't got any information about the airline accidents. So that made me even crosser. But then he said, oh, well, look, I'll find something for you. So he goes scooting up on a huge ladder in his excellent, marvelous, huge, wonderful library, and picks out a typed transcript of a case of where somebody brought. It's in the book. It's a case of a man whose 95-year-old mother was embalmed all wrong, so that insects got into the coffin or something. And it was a hilarious reading, actually. I mean, the idea that anybody would sue for that. But of course, Melvin Belli won the case. And, but, I mean, that was just one of the kind of incidents that happen when you're in the middle of writing something. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
What is the book, Daughters and Rebels?
Oh.
Is that a documentary or is that fiction? Or?
The question was, but what is Daughters and Rebels about? And actually, it's an autobiography of life, really, sort of in England and America between, well, in England, yes, and America between the wars. It's about my own family and my husband and that sort of thing. Anyone else? I think we've had it. Oh, yes.
May I come up? My throat is...
Yes, indeed, sure. I don't know how to work this, but somebody will.
I think you just swing it.
It's swung.
It's swung. All right. I'm from Denver, and I'm a member of the Rocky Mountain Memorial Society. But I'm here as the guest of two wonderful board members from the Palo Alto Memorial Society, both of whom live in Los Altos Hills. where I was very fortunate to be last summer. My question is not really a question. I have a problem, and I think maybe you can help me with it. I have a cookbook, which I happened to pull out last night, and the name of it is The Great American Writers Cookbook. And in it is my favorite recipe, which is by our friend Wally Stegner of Los Altos, California, for chocolate squares. So I took out the cookbook, and I kind of pawed through it, and I found a recipe by none other but Jessica Mitford, which was a recipe for roast duck and lettuce salad. And I would like to have you tell the story.
Terrible.
Would you tell the story?
I will,
A roast,
okay.
and also the
It's
cookbook is
cool.
out of print, and I don't know where to get it.
I don't know.
Stand here.
Sorry,
You read it.
Well, anyhow, I don't know if you heard the beginning, which was a cookbook, in which there was a recipe by me. Well, I know what it was. It was so awful. But when my son was sort of in grammar school, I don't know, he was about 9, let's say, and so the teachers got the idea of having of getting up a cookery book, which each child was going to get from their mother a favourite recipe. And so Benji sort of asked me, what's your favourite food? And I said, oh, go away, roast duck, you know. And he said, well, how do you make it? And I said, well, you get a duck and put it in the oven, and it was roasted. And then he said, well, what would you have with that? And I said, well, probably green salad. Well, how do you make that? Well, you get some lettuce and you know, because I'll tear it up and put it in a bowl and put some dressing on. I go away, you know, I'm writing or something. So that's how it came out that way. It was so awful because all the other mums, you know, had got wonderful things with loads of ingredients and sort of really sort of nice and elaborate things. And it was so sort of horrid for me trying to find it. So I decided it was the best thing to put in this cookbook because I was asked to write a recipe. Right, I think that's about it, right? One more.
If you can get the book anyplace.
No, I'm afraid I haven't a clue as to where to get the book, I'm sorry. No, that I don't know.
But you won the prize of the PTA. You've forgotten that. You won the PTA prize for the best recipe.
Oh, no, I didn't. I think somebody made that up. Yeah.
Back in the 30s, I was in the Bay Area, California. I was on the board of directors of the Bay Area Film Society. And Robert Truhoff was our board director.
Oh, yeah. Oh, right, yeah, so that's an old-timer from our neck of the woods. Thank you all so much for listening.
That was wonderful. We have one more. We have one more river to cross, and it takes the form of a certificate of appreciation to Jessica Mitford for her wonderful work. I'd like to read it because it was composed thoughtfully and affectionately for you. It reads, Certificate of Appreciation. This certificate is awarded to Jessica Mitford by the Continental Association of Funeral and Memorial Societies Incorporated, the Memorial Society Fund, the educational branch of our organization, and individual memorial societies throughout the land in recognition of the memorable stimulus for growth furnished memorial societies through her authorship of the classic The American Way of Death. Even as memorial societies observe 30 years of dedicated service to society members and the public, her impact was currently experienced again as her crusade for simple, dignified, and affordable funerals found expression in the nationally syndicated column of widely read Dear Abby. Words cannot appropriately acknowledge our debt for her contributions, nor adequately express our genuine respect for this very special person, whom, with affection and gratitude, we honor on the 30th anniversary of the Continental Association, June 19, 1992, in Denver, Colorado. still a little necessity for clinking of dishes and the like, but we're going to override you. We're going to speak loudly enough so you can hear while the dishes clink just a little bit, but we would appreciate as much sato dish as possible. I am privileged as the outgoing president of the Continental Association, and for those who, I suspect that some of our visitors on the right over here are from the Rocky Mountain Memorial Society, and we're awfully happy that you are with us. Some of you may have been at the meeting last night where I spoke, and so you know that I'm John Buchanan, the outgoing president of Continental. For those who weren't there, now you know who I am. I was asked to welcome you, and I'm certainly happy to do that. And also, I was asked to, in a sense, express to you a farewell on the part of those who are leaving the board. And we are, as is the nature of humanity, moving on. Not totally, but in a way that leaves space for the new members of our board who will be introduced in a short time. It's been an unalloyed pleasure to me to work with the fine people of Continental boards and the people in the societies I've had the pleasure of contacting either by mail or phone or in person. I won't say that it hasn't been a bit strenuous at times. It has. We've had some exciting board meetings, and we've made progress. Some of you know that we were for a time managed by a management firm, and during that time we felt a bit on adrift because the management firm did not have the fervor and the real desire to help their fellow humans in the matter of bringing rationality to the final arrangements in life. So for a while we did drift, but then we got up our courage and we went back to managing ourselves a year and a half ago, and we feel that we're really making headway to build a stronger organization, and with your help we're going to do just that. I would like to introduce at this time, for an introduction of board members, Dee Ferguson, who is first vice president of Continental Association. Dee?
Before you sit down, I'd like to present you with a little token of appreciation that we have. A certificate of appreciation, and I'll read it to you and to the audience. Certificate of appreciation awarded by the Continental Association of Funeral and Memorial Societies and the Memorial Society Fund to John Buchanan for exemplary leadership as Association President 1988 to 1992, for tireless work and dedicated commitment to the Memorial Society cause, consistently exercised with skill, patience, imagination, energy, thoughtfulness, and sensitivity.
That's me?
There's more. For creative and valued participation in the Los Angeles Memorial Society, Channel Cities Memorial Society, and the California Hawaii Federation. And this certificate is affectionately bestowed for many reasons for this man of all seasons. To John Buchanan, with prayers.
I have to accept this on behalf of the person without whom I would never have made it, my wife, Eleanor. And thank you all very much.
Now, just a moment.
Not more.
I know you'll put this where you can read it regularly, but it might get to be dull reading, after a year or two. So we have a book for you, and I can guarantee you it's not dull reading. I hope that you will pass along the enjoyment of some of its contents to those in your audiences later on.
An anthology from one of the spicier magazines, no doubt. Or an alligator hide bound copy of the Manual of Death Education. Oh no, this is a treasury of humor, an index collection of anecdotes. That's great. Thank you so much. I really enjoy reference books. That's the thing, about the only thing I'm buying these days. Thanks
The gifts
a
is
lot.
from the board. I wanted you to know
All
that.
right,
Yes,
I
sir.
appreciate that, board.
I didn't know how beautifully written that certificate of appreciation was, and I had one of those, the man who speeches already. Thank you. I didn't have to give it to you. I wouldn't have anyway. Would have been tempted, however. I have some announcements first before I do the introductions I've been assigned to do by John. First, the price list for wholesale casket price list is here, arrived today from Father Walaski, and you find them in the Creekside room after the meeting. They've been asked about.
That's brand new, updated from the last one.
The second announcement is that tapes of Ms. Mitford's address will be available immediately following this evening's program. Videos of Ms. Mitford's address will be available through Bill Eichelberger for a price of $15, which includes mailing. So if you're interested in the video, please see Bill Eichelberger before you leave for that. I want to introduce first the new board members, and I'll indicate the fact that some of the new board members have already been given important assignments as the new officers for the organization. I'll start on my right with new board member Fran Vogel. Would you stand and will you hold your applause until I've introduced all of them? You don't necessarily have to stand all that time, Fran, but and Fran is from the Memorial Society of Maine. Next, a new board member, and the person who will succeed John Buchanan is Pearson Ralph, on my right, who is from the Memorial Society, newly named, of North Texas. Thank you, Ralph. Over on my left is Henry Paul, who is a current member of the board, but is the new first vice president, and he comes from the Memorial Society of Northwest Indiana. Next to Henry is Dale George from the Memorial Society of Richmond, Virginia, who is the newly elected second vice president of the association. Farther down the table, Lisa Carlson. Lisa, new board member, immediately got a job as secretary of the board. Thank you, Lisa. Next is Larry Sakin on the end from the Tucson Memorial Society in Arizona. And I forgot to mention that Lisa is from Memorial Society of Vermont. Starting on this side again, now I'll introduce others. Would you give a round of applause first, however, to our new board members and new officers. Now, on this side, Paul Vogel, from the going off the board this year and has been treasurer. Next is Lynn Ralph, the wife of the new president of the board. And you have already met Eleanor Buchanan. Next is Mrs. Prawl, Laura Prawl, the wife of Henry Prawl. Next is Carol Green. And next is Bob Green, who is a current member of the board and going off the board this year. And the last gentleman I have not introduced is Bill Klein, who is a board member of the board of the Memorial Society Fund. And then in the audience, there are two people, another person who is on the Memorial Society Fund. That's Arthur Heim. Where is he? Could you please stand here? And I want especially for all of you to know and to express your appreciation to Bill Eichelberger for his work in preparing and planning this biennial.
We'd like to hear now from Jay Cherry, who was not named a moment ago. He is the president of the Maryland Society, Maryland and Environ Society, to present some well-deserved awards. Jay?
Gosh, everything's so heavy here tonight. I don't know about the cake. I'm saving mine until afterwards. But I take a look at the list of names on here, and I'm reminded of something which has to do with the fact that, you know, really everybody could read these themselves. I wouldn't have to be here and read them to you. But what I'm reminded of is the two couples who every year used to go out during the summer to a lodge, to a camp lodge, and they'd share space, but they would draw the curtain in between. But as they got older, they found out that all they had to do was take off their bifocals. I need my glasses yet. However, we are here to recognize for those people who, over the past almost third of a century, or some part of it, have been involved in this whole concept of what has broadly been called death education. It's an interesting title that Jessica Mitford has here, Death Warmed Over. I thought maybe they just turned down the flame. But people have been involved and perhaps have not been recognized in some way, so that those who are here tonight whose names I am going to read, the others are not here, so they wouldn't hear me anyhow, so I won't read their names. But if you would just, you know, stand and once again hold your applause as I go down this list. So we start with John and Eleanor Buchanan, who are right here. You have already seen them and witnessed them. And Lisa Carlson down at our other end of the line. You already see me. Arthur Heim, who has been recognized. He was out there. Oh, I see him hiding back there. A little hard for him to hide, but I see him. Bob Jones is around. Bob, Roberto, hasta la vista. There he is, right there.
Stand up and see.
He did. Bill Klein, down here, who was introduced, I think is the only person who has been with us since 1962. He was at that beginning organizing meeting, and then I first met him in '63 when we had the really first meeting of the association. If there's anyone else, let me know and we'll write you up in the next 30 years. Dick Middleton, former president, here he is in Princeton. Dee Ferguson, you already know. Henry Prahl, you already know. Pat Spar, who has been hosting us on our trips and excursions and so forth. Moved out here to the west from the east, but she was our hostess in 1986 when we met at Vassar College. Alan Stensland from Minnesota. We're glad to see him after 10 years of absence. He must be around. Absented himself again? Already. I thought he saw his name on here and decided to stay, but I guess he decided to leave. Fred Sweeten. Fred is here. There he is with the camera. Right, oh dear. Phil Towell, who belongs to 3 memorial societies, or used to, plus he's a charter member of MSUSA, the Memorial Society of the USA. And Francis and Paul Bogle Vogel down here at this end. Well, those are the ones who are here, and shall we?
Yeah.
So the microphone was on to make too much noise. Then I happened to have discovered that somebody left something here. I don't know, and I just happened to take a look and see something inside. I guess I'm supposed to do something with it. It says Marion Blake. She here? Oh, there she is. She's in the blue, royal blue. Marion Blake. In grateful recognition of your selfless support, your generous and unstinting efforts beyond the call of duty, your gracious thoughtfulness, your sparkle of caring, are an inspiration in the art of giving, and we thank you. And John Blake, in grateful recognition for bringing this organization back to life. Your devotion and warmth, your generous and unstinting efforts beyond the call of duty, your creativity and enthusiasm have given us all hope for contributing to a better society. Now, if you each will send a self-addressed stamped envelope, we'll mail them to you.
1-800